Welcome. Bienvenidos. Thank you for joining us today at Accessing Communications in Schools presentation by the Peel Center. Just a few things that we would like to remind you. This presentation is being translated simultaneously into Spanish. So in a few minutes, you will be able to see a globe like the icon that you have here to your left. So you can choose your preferred language, English or Spanish. I wanted to also let you know that this feature is used in the app version if you're joining us on an iPad or on a tablet. So you select the icon at the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language. Puedes seleccionar el icono de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla y va a poder escoger su idioma preferido. En los teléfonos móviles solamente se puede acceder a la función de interpretación utilizando la aplicación de Zoom. We're going to ask for you to also mute your sound to minimize the interference. Le pedimos por favor que seleccione el mute original del audio para que no interfiera con los otros idiomas que se están interpretando. All participants must select a language so they do not interfere with each other's language. And we're going to ask also that you, if you have questions, to keep them at the end of the presentation. If it is an immediate question or comment, you can go ahead and do it in the chat, but we will ask for you to keep your questions until after the end of the presentation. Les pedimos que si tienen alguna pregunta o comentario, que por favor las puedan poner en el chat al final de la presentación. Si es algo para aclarar, por favor pónganlo en el chat y lo podemos aclarar durante la presentación. Pero les pedimos que se esperen al final de la presentación. También les recordamos que hagan sus preguntas en sus idiomas. Si es español, por favor, háganlo en español. Y les podemos contestar en español con los intérpretes. At this moment, I'm going to ask Sue, our Director of Training, to join and welcome our presenters.
Okay, I want to be sure that everyone got a chance to select their language. Just a few seconds that you're going down and to the bottom to press on the globe and select your language. If anyone has any questions, please look in the chat where you can see the instructions again and refresh your memory if you came in a little bit late. Okay, so welcome to everybody. We're so pleased that everybody could join us today. Let's see, can we move on to the next slide, Natalie? Oops. Thank you so much. I wanted to let you know that we're able to bring presentations like this one to you thanks to the Peel Center's funders, which include the Pennsylvania Department Title V Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant and the Office of Special Education Programs, among other funders. So it's very, very important. Can you go to the next slide, please, Natalie or Anya? To let them know if we're meeting, how we're meeting the needs of the families we serve. And because of that, we wanted to bring your attention to this QR code. So this is something that you can scan with your phone. There's also a link there directly to the SurveyMonkey evaluation. It's a very short survey that you could fill out and let us know how the presentation met your needs. So we'll show this slide again at the end of the presentation, so you can again remember to go ahead and fill out the survey if you can. That would be wonderful. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. So quickly, as you may know, the mission of the Peel Center is to educate and empower families to make sure that children, youth, and young adults with disabilities and special healthcare needs lead rich, active lives as full members of their schools and communities. Next slide. And our topic today is central to this mission, which is why we're thrilled to welcome Tana Zemansky and Jordan Zimmerman here today. We're just so excited to be able to bring them to you. Tana is an attorney who received her law degree from Stanford Law School, who also earned her MPA from Princeton and has an undergraduate degree from Carleton College. Tana founded and is the executive director of Communication First, the nation's only civil rights organization dedicated to protecting and advancing the rights and interests of the estimated 5 million people in the United States who cannot rely on speech to be heard and understood. The next slide, please. And we are so excited to also welcome Jordan Zimmerman. She earned her bachelor's degree in education policy from Ohio State University and her master's of education from Boston College. As a non-speaking autistic student who was denied access to effective augmentative communication until she was 18, Jordan brings us her personal experience with challenging the educational status quo, which is featured in the 2021 documentary, This Is Not About Me. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass the screen over to Tana, who will now share her screen to give her presentation.
Can you see that okay?
It looks good.
Okay, great. Jordan?
Hi, I'm Jordan Zimmerman, pronouns she and her. I am a white woman, with wavy brown hair, wearing a black shirt. I am sitting in front of 2 floral paintings, and I type to communicate.
Oops.
I could give my image description. I'm also a white woman. I'm in my late 40s. I'm wearing glasses. I have a wonky left eye, and I'm wearing a purple shirt and sitting in my home office.
Hannah, sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, you can't see.
You have the block. Yeah, sorry.
Let me move that. Sorry. All right, is that better?
Yes.
During our presentation today, we have 3 objectives. First, we will tell you about us, and why communication should always be the first priority in your advocacy. Then, we will all reflect on best practices and students' rights to communicate in schools. And finally, we will share some tips to help you apply new advocacy strategies.
But first, we'll just introduce you quickly to Communication First, which is the only civil rights organization that's led by and for what we estimate to be 5 million children and adults in the United States who can't rely on speech alone to be heard and understood. We launched in October of 2019. In fact, just a few days ago, we celebrated our third anniversary of our launch. We're a cross-disability organization, and we are led by folks with disabilities, especially folks who need and use AEC. I'm not going to go through everyone who's involved in the organization, but you can see our board and leadership and staff folks at the link about us on our website. So our mission is to advance the rights, autonomy, opportunity, and human dignity of our historically marginalized population. And we use three key strategies to do that. The first is public education and engagement. The second is focusing on the reform of policy and practices. And the third is engaging in direct advocacy through the legal system and more informally as well. So who we are. Our community, as I mentioned, is we estimate over 5 million people in the US with speech-related disabilities. And that includes folks who were born without the ability to speak or with a speech-related disability or who developed it early in life. And that includes folks with apraxia, autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, rare genetic syndromes, Tourette syndrome, etc. It also includes people who acquired a speech disability later in life, including people who get ALS, aphasia or dementia, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury, and multiple sclerosis. And the folks in these two different sort of groups have very different life experiences, obviously, but we thought it was important to be broad and inclusive in our focus, in part because anyone who has a speech-related disability tends to experience the same type of discrimination and low expectations, regardless of what caused it or when in life they acquired the speech disability. And the other reason is that, as we'll talk about later, the law regarding communication rights and access is the same regardless of what caused your speech-related communication disability.
This slide has a green box with a photo and text that reads, "Communication is a basic need, a basic human right. And more than this, it is a basic human power." This is a quote by Bob Williams, co-founder and policy director of Communication First. Communication First is run by, and for people who need and use ASC. Bob is a lifelong ASC user, and the most senior federal government official, who is also an ASC user. He left a senior position at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to join us. In the photo on this slide, Bob is at the head of the table in the Roosevelt Room in the White House, with some folks who might be recognizable in the background, including President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder. Broadly, our work is about changing the social narrative and public understanding about people who cannot rely on speech to be heard and understood. This also involves reducing barriers and ensuring equal opportunity to meaningfully participate in all aspects of life and community. We do this through public and community events that provide education on issues impacting our community, creating resources and engaging in policy reform, and by engaging in direct advocacy.
So more specifically, our work is focused on ensuring access for everyone who needs it to robust expressive communication tools and supports, and we'll explain what we mean by that in a minute. We have spent a lot of time working in the healthcare area in terms of improving access for folks in our community to healthcare services and programs, and also to improving practices surrounding the ethical obligation of healthcare providers to seek and obtain informed consent from all of their patients, even folks who may not be able to speak, which currently rarely happens, unfortunately. We spent a fair amount of time working on improving self-determination of folks in our community, including on working on alternatives to guardianships and conservatorships. And we are increasingly focusing on ensuring equal access to justice for folks who may need and use AAC, including the ability to report a crime that they have either been a victim of or witnessed, including going through forensic interviews where they are interviewed about a potential crime, and including testifying in court and providing evidence. Just a few examples of some work that we've been engaging in the last couple of years. During COVID, we spent a lot of time working in to ensure folks who were admitted to hospitals were able to access the in-person supports they might need. So as you may recall, there were a lot of policies in place in hospitals that said you can't have a visitor. And that those policies ended up discriminating against a lot of patients who needed another human being to help communicate questions or concerns or pain or whatever. And so we ended up doing a fair amount of work in that space, including filing complaints with the Office for Civil Rights. We created a communication rights toolkit. We also created an educational toolkit for students on their rights to have equal access to remote schooling, meaning if they required another human being to help them access the same remote opportunities that students without disabilities were having, they had that right. Our first lawsuit that we filed was against the issue of restraint and seclusion against students with disabilities in schools, which we settled successfully. And currently we have a grant to improve data equity surrounding our population. So we keep saying an estimated 5 million people. That's actually a number that we came up with ourselves by looking at all the various 24 or more disabilities that may cause a speech-related disability and sort of backing into it. And the reason we've had to do that is that the federal government, although it counts folks with vision and hearing disabilities, it actually does not count people with the third major communication disability, which is speech-related disabilities. So in the next few months, we will be releasing the report from our grant project that we're working with the Disability Rights and Education Defense Fund on, and that project is called AAC Counts. So those are just some examples of work that we've engaged in recently.
On the screen, there is a thumbnail video that is black with white text that reads, "See us, hear us." Most recently, in celebration of the 3rd anniversary of our public launch, which was last Friday, we premiered a 6-minute video, the first in our new See Us, Hear Us series. The series will profile 10 to 12 diverse folks who need and use AAC. Coincidentally, I'm the first person profiled in the series. This was filmed long before I became the chair of Communication First. Do we have time to watch it?
Yes. Susan, yes, go ahead.
My name is Jordan Zimmerman, and I'm 27 years old. I communicate via an application on my iPad, by typing letter by letter, which then generates words, and speaks aloud, when I'm ready. I earned my bachelor's degree in education policy from Ohio University, and most recently, I earned my master's of education from Boston College. I currently work at a nonprofit as the director of professional development.
It's difficult to explain the intense emotions of what it was like before I had effective communication. I was really unhappy. I was restrained on a daily basis for years. The teachers would set timers, get off of me when the law mandated it, and then resume restraining me. I repeatedly went home with bruises and other injuries, but was unable to share about the trauma I was enduring. My family has been very supportive, especially my mom. She was a fierce fighter for my needs.
Okay.
I was inside of you.
Yes. And that's her big brother Andrew. He was 3.
At the same time, she was repeatedly told that I would not be successful with AAC at the time. There was such a focus on my behaviors, that it was almost a prerequisite in a way, which just shouldn't be. The process of obtaining an effective system of communication was excruciating. It took days and months of advocating from my parents and attorneys, against a school system that failed to see my potential, and frustration that was internally stuck inside of me. I surprised everyone when I started typing.
I drew and colored all 4 of those squares. They all have my initials hidden.
I was 18 years old and every day was an extreme challenge. The school did not take well to my form of advocacy. I was in and out of the local public high school, and had a few segregated placements at schools aimed towards the instruction of autistic students. I experienced long hours of pointing to my nose, repetitively completing addition and subtraction problems which I had done for years before, listening to people speak about the troubles I caused, and there were other times where I was not at the public school, because the district said they could not serve me. Regardless of where I was, the academic content that one would expect at each level was essentially non-existent. I have most definitely felt underestimated because of the way I communicate. I often think of the educational reports that were written about me. I was listening the whole time, and they broke me internally, in pieces. When I was in middle school, I vividly remember hearing about my IQ test that was in the 60s. I don't know why that sticks out so much, and I now believe these tests are a terrible measure. My experience in college has been amazing and significantly challenging at the same time. College was the first time I was ever on my own. I lived on campus all 4 years of undergrad, ate at the dining halls, started an inclusive cheerleading team, and naturally learned new skills. However, there is also some bad and ugly. I was constantly assumed to be deaf, asked if I was really a student on campus, and how I could live there. People are impatient and language moves fast. I hit the wrong buttons and forget where phrases are. But worst of all, I am automatically presumed to be incapable of tasks I am attempting to accomplish. Ableism is a real challenge.
Yeah, that was fun. I also like that because while the audience is obviously people dedicated to improving the lives of people with disabilities.
I have 2 broad tips for people without communication disabilities who want to be better allies. Everyone has language, and a story to be told. My behaviors became the only language I knew, biting and spitting when I didn't want something, and running when I was overstimulated with my inner dialogue. Every person has language and every person has experiences, which prompts them to want to make a difference. The problem is that when others don't acknowledge our language, we may not realize our potential to create change. Presume competence. Unfortunately, systems are focused on deficits rather than strengths. This commonly sets people up for failure, as everything is based on their perceived level of intelligence or disability. However, everyone is capable of doing amazing things. Get to know people so that you can offer them opportunities to show what they know, in a way that is effective for them. Improving the lives of all people who need AAC starts with making sure everyone has access to effective communication. We also need to make sure students with communication disabilities are meaningfully included within their school environments. We need to refocus our efforts on being kind, and that doesn't require any spoken words. It should not take me or anyone else trying to convince someone, for them to understand that communication is a right. Communication is what we do as humans.
Okay. So thank you for that, Jordan. When we give our presentations, we really like to focus, spend a few minutes focusing on what communication really is, because what we realize is that if you've never experienced any difficulty in your lives with getting your point across or being understood, then you probably haven't really spent a great deal of time thinking about what communication really is. So we're going to spend just a few minutes really trying to step back on what may seem like a fairly elementary concept, but what we think is important to ensure everyone has a broad understanding of. So what is communication? It's important to really realize and think and internalize that it's always a two-way street. You can't have communication with just one person, right? So it's always a back and forth engagement. So communication can include receiving and perceiving information. So that includes seeing, reading, hearing, listening, touching and feeling. So that's a receptive type of communication. It can also include processing and understanding information. So that's receptive and cognitive. It can include asking questions to clarify your understanding. That would be an expressive type of communication. It can include expressing your decision, a preference, a desire, a feeling, including fear or pain. Some examples in this domain include asking or providing informed consent in a healthcare context, can include voting, can include signing your name, engaging in commercial monetary transaction. Emojis can be a form of communication. And then also, pointing, gestures, facial expressions, eye gaze, and laughing are all forms of expressive communication as well. And it can include information your body may communicate about your physical or emotional state, like signs of pain, nausea, anxiety, and fear. And the reason we try to be broad about all of these things, or try to encourage folks to think very broadly about all this, is these are all things that have come up in our advocacy in terms of trying to explain to hospitals, for instance, or schools, why a particular person may be needed to support someone with a communication disability, because the point of that person isn't just to convey the language that they might be trying to communicate. Like, for instance, if you think about an ASL interpreter or a Braille, providing Braille or that sort of thing, but it's also to be able to know when that person is anxious or in pain or whatever, because they may be showing that, communicating those important intents and ideas in ways that may not be immediately obvious to someone who's not familiar with that individual. So in all contexts, if you're advocating for someone with an expressive communication disability, I encourage you to think very broadly about all the different types of ways they may need to communicate. And that is both receptive and expressive, but also cognitive. So being able to understand what is being told to them or conveyed to them, but also how they might be communicating as well. And this comes up all the time with folks with aphasia as well. So we also really try to stress that people understand the difference between speech and language. Speech is not the same thing as language. It's important to understand that speech is actually a motor function and language is a cognitive function. They're generated in different parts of the brain. And there's simply no anatomical basis to assume that someone who can't speak also can't understand or express language. This is a very commonly held misunderstanding. It's not really clear why people assume this automatically, that if someone can't speak, they also have an intellectual disability. But it happens all the time. I just want to show you this graphic created by Linda Robinson that shows all the different parts of the brain that are engaged in some type of communication. So in the blue area, the Broca's area, that's where language is produced. And then the speech part is in the red area. So you can see from this simplified description or visual of the brain that speech and language are generated and processed in different parts of the brain.
Now that we all know the difference between speech and language, it's important to learn about some of the harm that happens when folks might not understand how they differ. IQ tests are not valid or evidence-based for people who cannot rely on speech to be understood. These tests require the test taker to have some reliable speech and motor movement, and when they don't, it is often assumed they have no language. For example, as you all saw in the video, I was given IQ tests when I was younger, with scores calculated to be in the 60s, and that number was presumed to be accurate until I had access to reliable and effective communication. That was then used as a basis for denying me opportunities, and assuming that I was uninterested in engaging with others, learning, and being challenged. When IQ tests are wrongly administered, they are often used to deny access to WASI and force segregation. It is important that students are not given this test unless they use robust, language-based WASI and can use that WASI to take the test as required by federal law. Our language also has a lot of power, because words can be super ableist. To provide a few examples, non-communicative is inaccurate and harmful. Everyone communicates. People may use various forms of body movements, which can include blinking, breathing, and moving away, or towards. They may type or point. There are just so many ways to communicate, and each one is valid. Nonverbal is also inaccurate, because as we have discussed, speech is not the same as language. When we define the root word, verb, it implies language. Therefore, nonverbal is suggesting that we are without language. We are often very verbal. Lastly, the word severe is very dehumanizing. It's important folks don't use euphemisms and other words that diminish our disabled lives and further stigmatize us.
So we're often asked, what if we don't like those terms, what do we use instead? So as an organization, a national organization that tries to be very broadly inclusive of anyone who may have a speech-related disability, we try to be as descriptive, broad, and inclusive as possible. So we tend to use this very clunky term that's people who cannot rely on speech alone to be heard and understood. So that would include folks who may have an intermittent or occasional need for AAC, but can speak some of the time. Yeah, so that's sort of the not ideal phrase that we use because there's no real good shorthand. We'll also sometimes use people with expressive communication disabilities, people with speech-related disabilities. If we're in contexts where people know what that term AAC is, we will use that term, but that's sort of a jargony term that not everyone knows. So I will also note that the term non-speaking, we generally don't use that to describe when we're talking about our entire community, because while the autistic community tends to prefer that term, there are folks from other parts of our community who don't like the term. So we will use it when referring to autistics. And we are coming out in the near future with a document that we're calling Words We Use, which gets into some of these, some of this terminology in a little bit more detail. So stay tuned for that.
Effective communication is so important in all facets of life. It's recognized as a fundamental human right. Effective communication is so important in all facets of life. It's recognized as a fundamental human right.
I think is there an issue with we're hearing the Spanish interpretation.
Georgina, if you please switch to the Spanish channel. Thank you.
Effective communication is so important in all facets of life. It's recognized as a fundamental human right, a basis for all other human rights. As such, effective communication is necessary for education, emotional well-being, access to medical care, citizenship and voting, social relationships, safety and due process, self-determination, and meaningful employment. We really can't overemphasize the importance of effective communication, because it's an access point for everything else. The U.S. Congress recognized the importance of communication in the preamble, or findings, section of the Americans with Disabilities Act, when it was passed in 1990. It explicitly included communication barriers, as among the forms of discrimination people with disabilities can face, along with exclusion and segregation. It also included speaking and communicating, in the ADA's definition of major life activities, on par with breathing and thinking. When someone is presumed to lack communicative intent or the capacity to understand language, effective communication strategies are often denied. When this happens, people face miseducation, isolation, depression, restraint and seclusion, lack of opportunities, and trauma. For 18 years, the denial of communication strategies, paired with trauma and isolation, was all I knew. It is a vicious cycle, because it is very difficult to prove an understanding of language, when that is being used as a basis to deny supports. In fact, my mom was repeatedly told that I would not be successful with ASI at the time. There was also an assumption that I had no understanding and professionals saw my behavior as being unintelligent. They focused on my behavior and made the assumption that I would not be able to express myself with any form of language, assuming I had none. This led me to be segregated and denied access to curricular opportunities until the age of 18. It took multiple due processes and years of advocacy for me to receive the appropriate communication supports, and even then, it was difficult for folks to recognize that I belonged, and that I was worthy. Augmentative and alternative communication is anything other than speech that can help a person be understood. As we touched on, no one is non-communicative, and everyone uses various forms of communication, whether you recognize it or not. Some of these include gestures, eye gaze, pointing, facial expressions, sounds, body positioning, laughing, smiling, pointing or looking at pictures and icons. It also means robust, language-based ASI, which includes writing, signing, typing, texting, pointing for letters and words that can be combined to communicate anything, or someone revoicing. It's important to understand that ASI does not hinder speech development. In fact, research has suggested it supports it. ASI should also never be considered a last resort, and should be offered as an option to everyone and anyone who may benefit, as early as possible. This slide has visual examples of various types of ASI, from low-tech to high-tech. I'm happy to discuss any, if you have questions. Some best practices include giving access to ASCII as early as possible and making sure students have access to the full alphabet. It's also important that communication supports are available all the time. ASCII should not live on a shelf or a table. It needs to be with the person during the day and easily accessible at night. Communication partners need to know how to support the ASCII user and what the person's preferences are. Every person has conversational preferences, and it's important communication partners are well versed in those, as not understanding that can be the difference between someone eagerly using their ASCII or someone being overcome with anxiety because they are not being well supported. That also leads me to assume a trauma history. But do not assume a hearing or language disability. We have to presume competence and knowledge. While everyone is different and everyone's path to learning may vary, there is nothing better than 26 letters. When people are given pre-programmed pictures or words, they are often focused around what the communication partner wants to hear. However, when an ASCII user has access to the alphabet, they have the autonomy to say what they want. Of course, practice is important, and the learning curve will be different for each person.
Okay, so for the next few minutes, we're going to cover communication rights at school. In addition to the short film we watched that was just released on Friday, I highly recommend checking out a longer documentary that was produced about Jordan and was released last October, about a year ago, called This Is Not About Me. We, around that time, hosted a webinar so AAC users could interview Jordan about that experience. We're not going to play that here. It's about an hour long, but in the resources section, we'll include these links, and we'll share the slides with the Beal Center so you can access them later. Highly recommend it, though. The toolkit that we created with AAC users also includes a number of tips for the educational context. So just broadly, communication rights at school are governed by 3 different statutes in the United States. The first, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. Second, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And third, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 2014, joint guidance from both the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Education made clear that all 3 of these statutes apply to schools, to public schools, when it comes to students with communication disabilities. So it's not just the IDEA, but all 3 apply. When advocating for communication support people in the school context, it's really important to talk about to ensure that the people who are supporting a student with a communication disability are trained to support the student's individual needs. And the training really should not include just their form of language-based AAC, but also how they communicate using body language. So, for instance, they should be trained to understand, what does it mean when that student paces back and forth? Is it they're anxious? Is it they need to go to the bathroom? Is it that they're hungry? Are they about to have a seizure? How can you tell when this person is in pain? How do you know when they're hungry or thirsty? It's also important that support people are trained to be very conscientious and aware of trauma issues, safety issues, and power differentials. Those are huge, huge factors in whether a student is well supported in school and can have equal access to educational opportunities. As Jordan mentioned a few times, trauma is really almost universal experience for folks who've been denied access to communication. In fact, one of the things we're working on is trying to develop a more commonly accepted idea that if anyone has been denied access to effective communication for any significant period of time, they should just automatically be assumed to have experienced some kind of complex trauma. The other function of a communication support person in a school or any context is I believe, really should be part of their role should be advocating to ensure, for example, accommodations are provided. So we'll get into some detail about IEPs and accommodations, but one thing that's always struck me is, oftentimes even if a school can agree to provide a number of accommodations, more often than not, there are times when that someone forgets to ensure to provide or offer one of the accommodations. So, but then the onus of ensuring that the accommodation is provided ends up being on the student, the person who has very significant disabilities more often than not, and who is the least well equipped to then why are they supposed to be sort of going out of their way to say I can't access this because you're not providing my accommodation. So an additional role of a support person could be to advocate to ensure accommodations are provided. So back to the statutory framework. I'm going to touch a little bit on the differences between the IDEA and ADA because chances are most of you are less familiar with the ADA. So I'd like to sort of think about the IDEA as a statute that's mainly about providing services. So, transition, teaching a student how to use AAC, AAC, the IEP can include access to AAC as an accommodation, but a lot of it's really just surrounding services, specialized services, related services, etc. Whereas the ADA and 504 are more about sort of rights, access, equity, opportunity, and anti-discrimination. And these apply to most public and private settings, not just schools and colleges, but also recreational settings, your local Parks and Rec department, for instance. And in those cases, access to AAC would be an accommodation. So here's just a little bit more detail about sort of how I sort of think about these things. I often, the IDEA is great, but there are a lot of issues, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, and it's very frustrating in many cases. The ADA, if you look at the IDEA, a lot of the language in the statute is, a little wishy-washy, right? So the terms are free and appropriate education, but what's appropriate? The least restrictive environment to the maximum extent appropriate. Who decides what these things are, right? Related services that are required to assist the student with a disability to benefit from. Like, what does that mean? You have to consider the communication needs of the child, consider whether they need assistive technology. So, whereas by contrast, the ADA mandates equal access and opportunity, must provide the most integrated setting. And then, again, it's really focused on anti-discrimination and the accommodations that might be needed to ensure equal access and opportunity. The other thing to note is that the ADA provides additional rights above and beyond what the IDEA requires. So some of the examples include an effective communication, which I'll get into in a second, but also, for example, service animals. There's a separate requirement under the ADA that a person with a disability who needs a service animal should be provided that access, whereas under the IDEA, there isn't that right. There's also, commonly known like ramps and elevators, so physical accessibility requirements that aren't in the IDEA. There's also 2 additional provisions in the ADA that aren't in the IDEA, which include a requirement not to retaliate against a person with a disability who's advocating on their behalf, or someone else who is advocating on behalf of a person with a disability. So if you're a parent and you're advocating on behalf of your student, your child, there's a separate law that says the school can't retaliate against you for your advocacy. And that's under the ADA, not under the IDEA. And finally, there's a monetary damages provision under the ADA that does not exist under the IDEA. I did want to go over some of the specific language in the IDEA just quickly. I'm not going to read through all of this, but the IDEA does require that schools have to ensure that assistive technology devices or services or both are made available to a student. But then it says if required as part of the student's special education related services or supplementary aids and services. I've always thought that was really circular language, but be that as it may, the definitions of assistive technology device and assistive technology service can be very helpful. So the language in the statute includes, it defines an assistive technology device to mean any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf or modified or customized, that can be used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of a child with a disability. So that includes AAC, any type of AAC, a low tech, no tech, high tech, device. And then assistive technology service includes the choosing and then using, but also training professionals, the child and the family where appropriate, as well as employers in the transition context, but also customizing and repairing and replacing the AT device. So that, that would include training a team and the family and the student on how to use AAC so that it's effective for them. So these are definitions in the IDEA statute that are helpful to know. So turning to the ADA, as I mentioned, there are separate provisions in the ADA that are quite good on communication. So the ADA requires that any public entity, including a public school, must ensure that communications with people with disabilities are as effective as communications with others. So what does that mean? That means that if necessary, they must provide what they're called appropriate auxiliary aids and services, which is this very old-fashioned term, which basically means communication-related accommodations that afford the student with a disability an equal opportunity to participate in and enjoy the benefits of a service, program, or activity of the public entity. So, and then they have to give primary consideration to the requests of the individuals with disabilities when it comes to determining what the auxiliary aids and services are. So what all this means is if you have to sort of think about what a public school is providing to students without disabilities. What are all the services, programs, and activities that the school is offering? So including, lunchtime, recess, after school activities. Basically, these regulations are saying the school has to ensure that a student with any type of disability is provided with whatever accommodations they might need to have equal access. So if they're sponsoring a school play or there's a field trip or whatever, and the student needs some kind of communication related accommodation, that must be provided in order to ensure they have equal access. In terms of determining the type of auxiliary aid and service, the public entity has to consider the method of communication used by the individual, the nature, length, and complexity of the communication involved, and the context in which the communication is taking place. So they, in the guidance, they include the example of, for instance, if you're in a post office, and you need an auxiliary aid or service to buy a stamp, for instance, an appropriate auxiliary aid and service there might just be a pencil and a pen, or a pencil and a piece of paper for the customer to say, I want to buy one stamp or whatever. Whereas in a school context, if you're there for 7 or 8 hours a day and there's social opportunities and, engaging, being able to ask a question in class, you have to sort of think about that. So in that context, more likely than not, if you're a student with a speech-related disability, you may need, and in addition, if you're able to use a high-tech device like Jordan, for instance, is using, great. But even folks, a lot of folks may need another human being to support their use of their device. That may be more appropriate, whereas the post office might not have to provide another human being, but in a school context, they probably would to ensure equal access. And the standard is the accommodations provided must ensure that the public entity is able to have as effective communication with the students with disabilities as with others, folks without disabilities. And then there's guidance in the appendix of the regulations that says that the public entity has to provide the opportunity for the student to request the auxiliary aid and service of their choice, and must honor that choice unless it can just demonstrate that another effective means of communication exists, or that there are these other ways to get out of it, which are basically the school has to prove in writing that providing the requested auxiliary aid and service or communication accommodation would either cause a fundamental alteration or an undue burden. And the burden is assessed to the school district's entire operating budget. So there's guidance that makes clear, like for instance, for a student who's deaf, when you use ASL interpretation in a school, you need 2 full-time interpreters because they go back and forth usually every 15 or 20 minutes. And they make very clear that 2 full-time ASL interpreters for a single student would not be an undue burden. So if you think about that and the provision of a communication support person for a student who needs AAC, there's just no question that would be an undue burden. And even if they were able to establish an undue burden or a fundamental alteration, the school still has to take any other action to ensure that students with disabilities receive the benefits or services provided by the public entity. So they're not just out of it, out of the obligation, they still have to make sure there's equal access. So this is the guidance I've been referring to. It came out in 2014. It was jointly issued by the Department of Education and Department of Justice. And it confirms again that public schools must adhere to both the IDEA and ADA, and that very different standards apply in both statutes, and that the IDEA doesn't trump the ADA. And as well, that in addition, the student choice about the form of communication related accommodation is key. So if a deaf student, for instance, prefers CART, a live captioning, transcription over ASL, then that's what they should be provided. If they prefer ASL over CART, that's what should be provided. The other, I'm not going to include all the sort of interesting things from this guidance, but one bit I think is notable is that it makes clear that as long as the school knows or suspects that a student has a communication disability, they have an affirmative obligation to provide effective communication, auxiliaries and services, whether or not a parent requests a specific auxiliary aid and service. So they have an affirmative obligation. If they know someone can't speak, they actually technically have an affirmative obligation to provide AAC. So in summary, just quickly, schools have to comply with both the ADA and the IDEA. ADA creates very different rights and imposes stronger substantive requirements on schools than the IDEA. And this is especially true on effective communication and inclusion, which we'll get into in a second.
Tana, could I interrupt for 1 minute?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just because we are at 1 o'clock now, I just want, there may be an opportunity to answer a few questions before we move forward into the next session. Natalie, have there been any questions that we could ask? I don't have my chat all the way up. Let's see.
At my chat, we have Heather previously asked. Let me go back up. Or if you also would like to raise your hand, although it's going to be a little bit difficult. Heather had asked a specific question to Jordan. At what point in your education were you at the table advocating for yourself, and what impact did your voice at the table have on your education? If you want to answer that now, or should we wait for the end for this specific question? And another question, I guess, to both is, do you recommend learning letters via the keyboard placement or the alphabet in order on a device?
I'm just going to say I can't see, for some reason my video thing disappeared when I was doing the movie thing, and I can't get it back, so I'm not going to be able to see anyone at all, so I apologize. So I'm just going to leave it to Jordan for now.
I recommend learning letters. I think letters are way more powerful and allow for autonomy. In regards to Heather's question, I attended my first IEP meeting when I was 19 years old. The school wanted me to go to a farm day rehabilitation program, and I remember the intense emotion of relief when I was able to type no.
Thank you so much for that, Jordan. Should we take a few more questions before Tana moves on?
We do have a lot of questions in here. How are we doing on time?
Well, I think we're we can maybe we should finish and then take the remaining questions at the end, just to make sure that all the content gets shared.
Great. Yeah, there's great questions as well. So
Okay.
why don't we continue?
Okay.
So what is effective communication? Basically, the IC user must have access to those 26 letters I have mentioned a few times. The alphabet is so important. I can't even explain the frustration I faced when I was given pictures that had nothing to do with what I wanted to say. It's really important that the person can say what they want, that they can produce original, unlimited, and open-ended output. Some questions you can always ponder is if the user can conjugate verbs. Can they write poetry or an opera? Take up physics or calculus? Engage in wordplay? Tutor a struggling classmate? These are all things a person should have the option to do. Ineffective communication systems limit potential expressive output and do not meet the person's individual needs. They often assume the person has an intellectual or language disability, rather than a speech disability.
So just some quick advocacy tips. We encourage you to think about all of the students' disabilities that might require whatever support it is you're requesting. So it could be a variety of things. It could be ADHD, it could be apraxia, it could be a cortical visual impairment, anxiety, sensory impairments, insomnia, GI issues, OCD, epilepsy. All of these things can impact communication, and they can do so in different ways. One one question we have is whether, to encourage you to think about whether the autism, like if you're dealing with students with like non-speaking autistic students, basically the point here is, what value does listing autism as the basis for the need for communication support, what does that really get you, given that autism is so different from person to person, so heterogeneous, and because it's there isn't really anything about the diagnosis per se that tells you anything about the way the person communicates or about the student's actual support needs. So one tip we often provide to families is, actually consider whether it's even that helpful to have as a primary disability category on an IEP. And the reason is, it rarely is a beneficial thing. So none of this is to say you shouldn't be proud of being autistic. It's just that when you have a new teacher who's getting your IEP and the first thing they see is the ASD category, IEP category, they're going to make a whole bunch of assumptions about that student, none of which are going to be accurate given how different every autistic student is, from each other. And it's not going to tell you anything about their potential or about their support needs. So when drilling down to think about the types of supports that might be needed, we encourage you to be a little more specific and drill down, especially for students who are autistic and tend to have additional diagnoses like the ones in the first sub-bullet here. And then really to focus on what are the individualized supports that the student needs to access school and to communicate throughout the school day, right? So let's say the student already has access to an AAC app or device, and they're able to use it. Chances are they're going to need support to use it somehow. Even the most sort of independent AAC users I know still often will need another human being to support them, even if that's just to make sure the device is charged or propped up, correctly in on their wheelchair mount or whatever. So, so oftentimes what's beneficial to folks with students with communication support needs is the full-time presence of an adult, and ideally a backup who is trusted by the student given the power and trauma issues that we've discussed, and also has been trained to support that student's individual disability-related support needs, including their communication support needs. So that would include, does the student get seizures? What does that look like when they get a seizure? Do they have toileting support needs? In addition to all the communication support needs, because it tends to sort of all the various disabilities tend to impact communication, and vice versa. So that would be an accommodation, for instance, one example of an accommodation. So other accommodations, these are just sample ones that we often see on IEPs for students who need AAC. I'm not going to read through this all, but these are very common ones that might apply. I do want to sort of note that one idea that even existed before the pandemic was an accommodation that it's possible to attend class remotely by Zoom or Skype or Teams or whatever. And that may, a lot of students, especially who are autistic, often have anxiety issues or whatever. And so, or day-to-day issues that may prevent them from going to school, that shouldn't mean that they're missing out on academic instruction. So especially now after the pandemic, where everyone's used to these things and people have devices and it's free, it absolutely would be a reasonable accommodation to ask for remote participation on occasion if needed due to the student's disability. Sample testing accommodations are included here for students who may need AAC, trains, the support person, extended time, quiet room, seating, paper-based versus computer type tests. You should think about what might work better for that student, read aloud and fidgets. Jordan?
When a student does not have access to robust, Language-based IC, it's important to refuse an IQ test. As I shared earlier, these tests are often used to segregate students or deny them access to the communication supports they need. When the school wants to administer an IQ test, you can ask what information they are hoping to get for purposes of eligibility or goals. And then it's important to argue that they are not evidence-based for students who cannot speak or move their hands reliably, they're stressful, they take the student away from instructional time, it's time-consuming, and we know that most often, it will result in an artificially low IQ score. Because of the way our systems currently work, these tests cause trauma that cannot be undone.
I did want to note too that we will be coming out also in the near future with a toolkit on this issue. So stay tuned and be sure to sign up for our newsletter if you want to see that. Just briefly, I wanted to include the language that the IDEA has about taking assessments. So this is additional, additional arguments for ensuring that a student is being administered appropriate assessments. The evaluation must be provided and administered in the child's native language or mode of communication. And they also, assessments have to be administered in a form most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, right? So if a student who needs AAC has any kind of motor disability, fine motor disability, which they almost always do, because speech is a fine motor skill. So they tend to also have difficulty with using their hands and pointing intentionally or holding pencils, then administering a test that is designed to test people who are assumed to have fluent speech or fine motor capabilities would not yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically.
You'll hear from a lot of IC users that we are internally social beings. We thrive when we are included and are miserable when we are excluded or secluded. Yet, we are most often segregated in school until we can prove ourselves. However, separate is always unequal in terms of curriculum, access, safety, and opportunities. There is also no study that shows a benefit of segregated placements for disabled or non-disabled students.
And they're also less safe, right? So the point being that there are no witnesses to report abuse. So I'm not going to read through this. Erin Sheldon is a member of our board, and she's written very eloquently about this issue. A lot of people think that a segregated placement for a student who can't speak is actually safer for them. But she's made the point that actually almost all the abuse that takes place of students who can't speak occurs in separate settings, right? And, one thing to think about is that one reason that might be is that there are almost never witnesses who can report abuse that they see, right? Whereas if a student is included in a regular classroom that has, 25 other pairs of eyes that can report and keep an eye on the student, you rarely see the kind of restraint, seclusion, and abuse that occurs in a regular classroom. So, so the last sentence here is, when a mark appears on our child's body, we need to be able to ask the other kids what happened. Our kids need the safety of 30 pairs of classmate eyes on them. A lot of people have trouble imagining how you would include a student with really significant support needs who can't speak and may need AAC, but it's hard to imagine if you've never seen it. These are 3 videos that Dan Habib has produced over the years that are examples of AAC users who've been fully included. And Dan also produced the video about Jordan that we aired earlier. So just in summary, in terms of advocacy, we encourage folks to request an AAC evaluation early and often for any student and every student who has any kind of expressive communication difficulty. Training for aides, teachers, and parents is always critical. Raise your expectations and challenge assumptions, and remember always that speech is not the same thing as language. Decline IQ testing as not evidence-based for students who can't speak or use their hands reliably. And keep in mind too, that literacy and language-based communication are perhaps the most critical life skills. And then inclusion. These are just at the end of the slides here, some resources that we recommend for learning more. Here's links to these films. And then just in conclusion, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, and if you're so inclined to make a statement with cool swag. Currently we have, for the next 10 days or so, we're selling some t-shirts, including this one, which is a quote from Jordan: "Speech does not make someone more human," and you can get that at our Bonfire store, which is linked there below. So we're happy to take questions at this point.